Thank you, Vedran, for inviting me here to this conference and for introducing me. So it's a great pleasure to be here, but it's also kind of a challenge because you all had the chance to discuss together for more than one time. So now I'm coming in from the outside, and it's hard to say something that is maybe interesting to you or is also challenging. And I see myself here in this role as not only a political scientist, but as well as rather a political person as well. So it's not possible to differentiate these two roles, I guess. So when I was listening to the first presentations today, I thought, well, it's interesting that the papers I got and I've been reading are maybe not so utopian as the others. So that was quite interesting for me. So that democracy is not anymore a term that might lead to some kind of utopian thinking in the long run, but we have a very clear idea of what democracy is. Maybe there are some more radical forms, but still we kind of think in the idea of representative democracy and how to fit in these terms of representative democracy. And it's quite interesting because, as we all know, the discussion is quite long that representative democracy is in crisis. So we've been discussing the crisis of representative democracies since the 70s of. So what can we say? On the one hand, the debate in the 70s was partially based on the idea of complexity, multi-level governance, globalization, and so on, and how political actors are even in a situation where they are not capable anymore of the political decision-making process. It's the loss of room of maneuver that was criticized back then. And then we had this new idea of post-democracy as a new term where we all could criticize the existing political system. And one underlying idea was that the economy came in as a very relevant factor, the idea of global firms influencing the political decision-making process in Western democracies, in the back rooms of the parliaments, politicians and global firms representatives would meet and decide on what's going on. So this was basically the idea of Colin Crouch. And also the idea that political decision-making has become quite short-term perspective, so parties orient themselves on demoscopic projects and see what is hip, and then they try to formulate a political program. So there's no real interest aggregation anymore in political parties. So then we had this East European transition, and what we can observe here, and we hardly discuss it in the same way, that somehow Eastern Europe entered from this socialist kind of system into post-democracy without taking the detour via a democratic moment of some kind. So what is quite interesting, so we are discussing about democracy, but we are discussing about a concept that a lot of people kind of think it's already faulty from the beginning. One aspect that is also stressed quite often is the fact that people as actors are hardly seen within democracy. So they are invited to vote, and then that's it. So maybe they can join parties, but we have the data, and it's quite clear that people do not join parties, but rather stay away from parties in both parts. So not only in Western Europe, but also in Eastern Europe. So there is also a very deep problem between the link of citizens and political institutions, which is actually the basis of democracy as we used to discuss it. So this is kind of the context, and then suddenly all these protests in Eastern Europe broke out, and we thought, well, finally there's something like a more broader social movement in Eastern Europe. It's not only NGOs, local or international, who fight for democracy in one way or another. But then there's also some kind of confusion. Well, is it really a challenge to democracy as a concept? And most of these big demonstrations deal with anti-corruption, good governance, and transparency. These are, first of all, not really leftist issues, and here we are discussing the new left. So what is so left about anti-corruption? Well, I don't know. I think we kind of are, well, there's a hope that from these kind of demonstrations something new will arise, but you could also frame it that here a very mediocratic representative democracy will be the result. So it's not about challenging the idea of democracy or challenging how people engage with society and what the issues are, but rather fulfilling the promise of the 1989, having a kind of mediocratic representative political systems where parties actually do what they are supposed to do. And so where is this profound leftist turn we all hope for? I don't know. I'm rather skeptical whether we can see it in these movements. So when we look on the data, we can see that most of the people in countries are rather reluctant to place themselves on the left and right scale of political attitudes. They rather gather in the middle. So everybody is on this 1 to 10 point, everybody is on digit 5. And there's also a very large number of people who say they don't know. So these are the biggest groups when we look at the data. People don't really associate themselves with any political opinion or any political sphere, but rather try to concentrate themselves in the middle. So democracy has become a very technocratic turn in a way, and it's missing the other concepts. And we do have them when we look at the theory, like participatory democracy or even radical democracy, where the political conflict is a very central issue to these debates. So where is this political conflict within our societies? Within the political system, and I think there is one point that is missing out. So all these papers were quite clear in saying there is something like a social movement coming up, and I'm rather cautious whether I can really join this idea right now, even though I would hope for it. So there's another thing I thought quite interesting when I heard about this conference and the series of conferences. I was thinking that the question of what is left will be on the table, and maybe you've discussed it extensively at some other points. In these papers, I was wondering, so what is the leftist ideology? So what are the central terms maybe we would like to work with and also stand for in the long run? And can we achieve a politicization of citizens and people when we are reluctant to address these issues clearly as left policies and with certain terms, and not rather policies but rather general ideas. We had heard the term solidarity quite often. There was also a debate of justice. So these are the relevant terms, and I think it is quite important that these are addressed so that this technocratic way of dealing with democracy will not continue in this context. And then after we might have established these ideas, we can talk about policies, and policies are of course very well ingrained in a specific certain local situation. So this also needs to be reflected. So on the other hand, we've seen that somehow leftist movements or parties are on the rise, even though they might not enter governments as Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn. And these are, interestingly enough, old white guys, and they still manage to get this message across and form a movement on very leftist issues. And I think one of the main points is authenticity. So they are very authentic in what they are doing over a long period of time. So there is an attraction to clear positions still. And I think this is something a left should draw on, and making it clear that somehow we need this ideological fundament to talk about it. So because a lot of these papers were kind of ambivalent on thinking about a strategic approach, how to evolve and how to maybe align with political parties or not, how to transform in a transnational movement. So there were a lot of strategic considerations in the papers, and I think this is important, but maybe it's a second step. So my feeling was that the first step should be, okay, can we somehow point out 4, 5 terms we can all somehow relate to in a different way and kind of modernize this leftist thinking. So the other point I saw in this paper, and I think this is also quite critical, the way, what should be the role of social movement or civic actors. So in some papers they came across as this kind of new think tank idea. So giving knowledge to the political system, giving knowledge to political parties, giving knowledge to policymakers. And yes, that's important, of course, but it's also, from a democratic point of view, you could argue rather critically, well, what's the legitimacy of these social movements so that they can play this role? So if we talk about democracy, we also have to talk about legitimacy. And right now, these social movements or civic actors are small in numbers. They are large in protest, but small in numbers when it comes to activism. So how do we make the connection between legitimacy of these actors in the political process without hearing or being confronted with the idea that they are just very strategic and trying to make a living, trying to influence politics and actually over the long term become political parties? So I think it's quite okay if we think about how to go forward and whether social movements want to transform into political parties. Well, as I said, the idea of representative democracy is living of this idea. But still, then we need to consider how these movements are still somehow connected to society. And some of these papers also had the idea of democratic innovations as new forms where people could meet and engage and discuss. And I don't know, I think we have to differentiate as well, because when we look at the literature of democratic innovations, it's quite clear that there are very different types of democratic innovations, and some rather reproduce this technocratic approach to democracy instead of a more substantial approach to democracy. So when we think, for example, about invited spaces of democratic innovations where people are invited to participate, we can see quite often that's a very instrumental approach by the political elite. So let's invite people, give them one point to decide upon, let them have the feeling it's important, and then afterwards we will tell them that's actually not relevant for the political process, but it's rather a consultancy they are doing here. So I think these democratic innovations have very many pitfalls, and they are quite often used as a strategic instrument by established political parties. So as well, they are not always, not only because they are participatory doesn't mean that they are left. So for example, if we think of the participatory budgeting process in Porto Alegre, it was a quite clear leftist agenda. When we look at Germany, most of the participatory budgeting projects are about cuts. So it's not about where to channel money to, what is important, what are the priorities, but how to legitimize budget cuts. So I think this is also quite important to reflect upon. And I think what is really relevant is the area where people or activists claim spaces, where they are not invited to participate, but rather where they say, well, this is an urgent issue and we want to deliberate, we want to discuss, and we also want to have the conflict within these bodies. So it's not always about finding a decision, but rather we heard it about the new liberal zeitgeist today. I think the new liberal ideas also perpetuated through discourses. So this is challenging the discourse in general that needs to be done maybe. So I think these papers kind of struggle with the placing themselves into the political system. Where should social movements, civic actors place themselves within the political movement, political society? How strong should be the ties to established political parties, or should they rather stay out? So I think these claimed spaces are one area where power is not yet so relevant, where, for example, success and failure are not that relevant because, from my understanding, because one paper also very much discussed the question of success and losses, I think it is a success when you change at least the discourse. So these are things you cannot really measure, and it's a long-term process, but I think we cannot only look at really policy outcomes, but rather at a more broader level. So these would be one point. And also it is very important to open up these closed spaces where no form of political participation is happening. And one aspect, so almost the last aspect I want to mention, is the question of internal structures. I found it quite interesting that none of these papers discussed it. So maybe, I mean, you only had 5 pages, and as from what I understood, it's not yet clear where they will be presented, in what form they will be presented, so it's very hard to do it. But I think these internal structures need to be reflected also when it comes to the question of authentic policymaking or authentic activism. So what are the internal structures social movements need? What are the aspects they need to focus on? For example, do they somehow reflect in their internal structures the values they promote, like equality, inclusion, and so on? So what is about the inclusion of marginalized groups? What is about what are gender aspects that might be relevant for these groups? How is this discussed? Because of course there is always a trade-off between ideas and powers, but I think therefore it's very important to reflect upon these power relations within social movements, and just do not ignore them or not reflect upon them. So on the one hand, it's the idea of keeping a distance to the political realm and not being too much in the political arena, because on the other hand, it's the idea of connecting to it, to making policies work. So it is a very different and challenging situations social movements are in. But one thing is also clear from the party research or research on political institutions, we kind of know that even new actors that enter these spheres kind of are pressured to adapt to these institutions that already exist, and their chances to modify these institutions the way they think they should work are rather small. So what we can see is also another trade-off between this idea of making policies work and engaging in these institutions and keeping their own identity that also, as I said, needs to be reflected in the structures that are presented. So from the theoretical part of the papers, they all deal, or most of them deal with the social movements, and I agree upon this, but I would be, as I said, very reluctant to be too optimistic whether we are already dealing with social movements. And I think it's very important to change this hegemonic neoliberal discourse and rather tackle societies and citizens in a broader way, and try to promote a new, or how to say, a different discourse on these issues. And therefore, coming back to the first thing I think it's quite important to have these ideas of what is the left, what are certain specific aspects of leftist policies that are not for debate, and what is a leftist identity and also leftist ideology in a way. So that would be my contribution.